My name is Trina Koboldick. I'm the Director of Student Services here at ISKL. And in my role, I oversee English as Additional Language, Learning Resource Programming, our Life-Centered Education Program, and our Counseling Programming. So really, a lot of my work that is interconnected with the Teaching and Learning team has to do with opportunities for inclusion and for social emotional learning. As you may be aware, social emotional learning is part of our school's strategic plan. And in the world that we live in today, these are the skills that students need, that your children need, to navigate the world, to be working in opportunities and jobs, to go off into college, and to navigate all of those complexities that we have. Today we're very, very fortunate because this week, we have presenters from IFSEL, the Institute for Social and Emotional Learning, that have been working with our staff and faculty. They've been working with our faculty, training them all week, and they'll be working with our staff and faculty during our in-service day on Friday. We've had a long-standing partnership with IFSEL, and I've gotten to know both Nick and Joe very well over the years. I feel very privileged. We started off on Zoom. They helped us so much in our strategic planning and our thinking and the ways we can build skills with students and skills for our own faculty and staff, because looking after your own social and emotional well-being and health is the way that you're able to help and look after your your students. Today, they're going to be speaking about conflict resolution and specifically giving you practical strategies as parents. So I know I'm looking forward to hearing the presentation, and I'm sure you'll get a lot out of it as well. Without further ado, I'll present to you Nick and Joe.
Trina, thank you so much. And good morning, everyone. Good morning. It is a real joy to be back with you. Give me a wave if you were here in this session when we were here in January. Okay, you guys get loyalty cards. I don't know what we're going to give you at the end when you complete your card, but whether you were here last time or not, it's really a delight to be back with you. As Trina said, my name is Nick. I'm here with my wonderful colleague Joe, and we're going to be your stewards, your shepherds with you for the next 90-ish minutes to talk a little bit about social emotional learning, the critical importance of these skills for our kids as they grow up in this wonderful school and head out into the world. And how we as parents can support our kids on that journey. And as Trina said, this work is nothing if we don't start with the adults, if we don't start with the teachers, if we don't start with us as parents and caregivers. So I want to start with a really big thank you. Thank you for being here this morning. Thank you for carving out this little bit of time for yourself. And maybe give yourselves like a little pat on the back or a little supportive cheer for making this happen today. It might feel like it's already you've had a whole day just getting your kids up, out of the door to school, getting here, getting settled. So let's just take a moment to catch our breath. You've made it, and I'd like to do introductions. So as Trina said, my name is Nick. I'm one of the co-founders and directors of the Institute for SEL. We are a small team with a big heart. We have the honor of doing this work with schools around the world. Joe and I were in Bangkok last week working with IS Bangkok, off to New York in a few weeks' time to work with some schools there. So it really is a joy and a gift to be able to share this work with schools around the world. By background, I'm a middle school teacher and high school teacher. I've taught upper elementary as well. Originally a geography teacher. Anyone who loved geography at school? No one? Okay, thank you. Good, I'll list a few of you. Phew! And then became an SEL specialist in the last few years. And with my colleagues, co-founded this institute in 2009.
Good morning, folks. My name is Joe Chen, and I wanted to extend Nick's appreciation and gratitude so much to y'all for being here this morning. It's good to see some familiar faces and some new folks as well. My name is Joe Chen. If you're a little curious about the last name, because I do present the way I do, you should probably know that my dad is Chinese and Vietnamese, and my mom is British and French. And then the joke is, I was raised in, can you guess it? Florida. Yeah, it's a fun one. So you'll hear my y'alls. That just means you all. That's my kind of southern way of being inclusive. My role with the Institute for Social and Emotional Learning is I'm a program manager and facilitator. So like Nick, I get to travel all over the world, presenting to teachers, educators, parents, students about this really critical work. Just so you know, though, one of our goals for today is to give you plenty of time to connect both with yourself as well as those at the table so that you're really starting to model and feel that SEL. Some of our other goals this morning are to really understand and explore what conflict is, what it means to us in our lives, where it comes from, and how that shows up with our students. And finally, to learn and share those strategies that Trina mentioned that are going to be practical, things you can take with you today out of this space to share with anyone in your life, really, including your kids, as well as your peers maybe, as well as your other family. But we wanted to start with a practice we call check-in before we even get into conflict. You just had a moment to share with your partners and your neighbors, but check-in is a time and an opportunity to really sit with ourselves and say, how am I feeling right now? Physically, emotionally, spiritually, intellectually. And we know that check-in, both as a practice and as an even one-off situation, has a lot of benefits. Some of those are things like growing your own self-awareness. In our busy days, we often forget to check in with ourselves and ask, how are we doing? So check-in gives us that pause and break. It leads to better decisions as well. If I check in and I realize that I'm actually maybe a little more energetic than I normally would be, that could lead me to a better decision to do something healthy or active for myself in a way that I might not have thought to do if I hadn't taken that moment to pause. It also builds our social awareness, so you'll have an opportunity to share with others. And when we hear how others are doing in the space around us, that grows our social awareness, increasing our empathy to let us know how the folks in the room are doing, and finally improve our relationships with each other as a result of that. That's a lot of me talking at you, but let me get into the actual practice itself. So for this particular check-in, we are going to ask you to take a look at this big old list of words, and we'll give a little extra time for some translation services to work on them. But we're going to ask you to pick 2 or 3 words that specifically describe any of your needs in this moment. So you might want to check in with yourself quickly, say, what do I need right now? And then scan through this big list of words and choose 2 or 3. There may be some other needs you have that are not present. That's totally fine. You may choose those as well. This is just a place to start off, jumping off point. Once you've had a moment to check in with yourself, to see what are my needs, to maybe find a few of them up there, we invite you again to find a shoulder partner, this time not the whole table, but just one other person that's nearby. And we invite you to share as much or as little of your needs with them. Similar to before, you'll have some quiet time, you'll start to speak to each other, and then you'll hear the chime to come back together. And that is starting right now. That chime is not very loud, but thankfully my voice is quite booming. If you can hear me, can you give me a wave, please? That's just really lovely. It's so nice to look out at a crowd of folks that are waving back at you. Thank you. Well, folks, I hope you had just a moment to check in with your needs and to share with your partner, whoever that shoulder partner was. This is my opportunity to remind you that if any of those needs include hunger or thirst, there are so many snacks over on the side provided by the school, so thank you very much for that. And there are restrooms just outside if you need those. It's quite early, but if you do need any movement, we will not be upset if you need to stand while we're talking or if you need to move around, so please continue to take care of your needs as best you can, and we'll try to hold this space for you as well.
Thanks, Joe. Well, lovely folks, the reason we wanted to start with a needs check-in today, the reason we wanted to start with thinking about our needs is because one of the things we know about conflict is that it often arises from unmet needs. Needs that we maybe know or don't know are being unmet in a particular moment. And as we reflect on that, maybe from your own personal experience right now, or thinking about what you've seen with your kids or with your kids and their friends, those unmet needs are really something we want to explore today. How can we address those? How can we help kids get those needs met in order for conflict to be avoided? But it's not possible to always avoid conflict, and when it does arise, how we can manage it more effectively. So scamming through this, have a think about what you've noticed in your families, with your kids. What kind of needs might be generating conflict, or unmet needs might be generating conflict? And our goal today is to think about how we might move from that space of conflict into a space of peace. But I'd also really like us to rethink how we consider conflict today. Now, we only have 90 minutes, And if you look around the world, you'll see that unresolved conflict's pretty prevalent. So we have to manage our expectations for this 90-minute session that we'll try. But your kids are going to be the ones that go out there into the world with these skills and are going to make the difference. So we can think about the ripples and the amplification of this work into the world in the years to come. So when you think about peace, even conflict, when you think about conflict, I'm curious what other words come up for you. What other associations? Just have a moment to think about what words or feelings do you associate with the word conflict in your own mind. Here are some things that kids say. They feel bugged, irate, forlorn, or this high school student's work here doesn't have words, but I think it speaks for itself. Often our association with conflict is negative. It's seen as a challenging, a hard, a difficult thing, something that feels maybe uncomfortable. Maybe we try and avoid it. Maybe we please our way out of it just by letting go and letting the other person have the win. There are lots of different reactions to conflict, but in my experience and talking to lots of kids and parents about this, often those reactions are negative. And they might be some of these things. Give me a wave if you've seen this sort of language before. Flight, fight, freeze, and fawn. Let me talk through these. These are sort of physiological responses to issues of stress or conflict. The idea of flight. When conflict's arising, we just want to get away from it. It's like, not for me, I'm stepping back, I'm going. Can happen, right? Fight, the alternative. Not necessarily physical fight, but you get stuck into that fight. You react to it with a more assertive or aggressive response. Makes us dig in, maybe dig our heels in as well. The idea of freeze, for many of us, conflict is such an uncomfortable place, we sort of just freeze in the moment. I see lots of nods for that one. And then the idea of fawn. Fawn may be one that you maybe haven't heard of. Fawn is where you please. You just let the other person have the win. You don't want to engage in the conflict, so you sort of people please and let them win. And those are sort of our common responses to conflict. But they all have a slightly negative undertone to them. So our challenge today is to reframe how we think about conflict. Conflict is a perfectly normal, natural part of life. It can arise because we have, as I said, unmet needs, or where we have a difference of opinion, or we have a misunderstanding. None of that is bad. It's an opportunity. So for today, we'd like you to think about conflict as an opportunity. And when we think about it that way, it allows us to practice our SEL skills, these amazing skills that your kids have been learning throughout their time at ISKL. It allows us also to clarify our values, to help understand, to build empathy. So shifting that from conflict being necessarily negative to something that is an opportunity for greater learning, greater understanding and connection can be a really healthy thing to try and talk to your kids about and to model. Because managing conflicts really is helping them put all these SEL skills into practice. And maybe that's just what we mean by putting it into a problem solving rather than seeing it as conflict. We're just trying to figure out a way through this problem together, not necessarily as a conflict that can't be resolved. So, we know that conflict and our responses to conflict really often come from how we experience conflict ourselves in earlier stages of our lives. So I'm going to invite you for a few minutes to share at your tables. When you were younger, in your family, in your communities, what did you learn about conflict? What was your model of conflict when you were younger? How did you communicate about conflict? How did maybe your parents or those who raised you communicate about conflict? And what about expressing emotion? I also want to say that conversation might feel uncomfortable or a little tricky, a little hard. So only share with anyone at your table something you're happy to share. Maybe I can start off by sharing that when I was growing up, everyone in my family modeled conflict in a way that it was to be avoided. If there was any sort of tension, we just all sort of went to our own separate ways and ignored that it happened, swept it under the rug. Right? Anyone else similar to that? Okay, maybe. In other families, it might be very, very different. Yeah. So just take a moment to chat at your tables. There's no right or wrong about how this is. We just want to explore a little bit and share. So maybe take 3 or 4 minutes. You could do it as a whole table or in pairs. What did you learn about conflict growing up? So these 5 tools here that you hopefully will now be familiar with are really underpinning what we'd like to share with you today. So here are our 5 tools we're going to dive through in the next hour. We're going to try and cover 5. Eek. The first one and the third one, if you were here in January, might feel a tiny bit like a review, but we're also going to take them in new directions. We're going to touch on some communication strategies, the idea of win-win solutions, and we're going to finish to your lovely point earlier about apologies. How do we sort of build relationship repair? We're going to talk about a tool called the contribution tool. So that's where we're headed. You ready, Joe? Let's dive in.
Let's do it.
Cool. So we know that if we would like to engage in any sort of work around conflict resolution, in helping bring kids together or work through something with our partners or at work, the place we have to start is with our own emotions and regulating those and knowing sort of how we're feeling. It's why we started with a check-in this morning, to really name those feelings you might be having in the moment. So one of the tools that we share a lot with kids and a lot with adults is this idea of a go-to cool-off strategy. And what we mean by that is, what do you do anytime, anywhere, that really allows you to catch your breath and regulate how you might be feeling, so that your emotions are data for you, they're not driving you. That is information, they're not forcing you into a particular action or a particular, saying something. So my challenge to you all today is to make sure that you have, and that your children have, an anytime, anywhere cool-off strategy. Because we know that for many of us, our cool-off strategy might be something like go for a run, or have a drink of water, or work out, listen to some music, lie down. And they're all good, don't get me wrong, but you can't do those anytime, anywhere, right? You couldn't do those like right now, for example. Or you couldn't do it in a meeting where you feel those emotions rising because of what's happening in the meeting, or when you're working with your kids, or in a parenting moment where you feel frustration or exhaustion coming to rise up. So what are the anytime, anywhere strategies? We brainstorm these with kids all the time, and they come up with things like taking some space, doing a draining visualization or a little sort of mind visualization. Any of the breathing practices? Do you know 7-11 breathing? Kids like this one. It's as simple as breathing in for 7 and out for 11. The idea being that your exhale is longer than your inhale. Helps you sort of regulate your vagus nerve. Box breathing. Do you know box breathing? It's one of my favorites as well. Box breathing is just you're going to draw a box, but as you go up, you inhale. Exhale along the top. Inhale as you come down. And exhale as you go along the bottom. And just the visual of doing that really helps kids, elementary, middle school kids in particular. They really like that one. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as you find the anytime, anywhere strategy that really works for you. And I think one of our biggest gifts we can give our kids is to help them find what works for them. Because what works for me doesn't work for Joe, what works for Joe doesn't work for Trina, et cetera, et cetera. We all have our different go-to strategies, but we've got to help kids find theirs and help us find ours. So after we've got cooled off and we've got to a good place and we're ready to engage, one of the bits of language that your students are learning here that hopefully you'll find useful at home is to think about how we can help our kids communicate. We're going to share 2 strategies that are sort of companion tools. One is speaking, the way in which we can speak when in conflict, and one is the listening side. And we like to think of those as sort of, you have to have both in order to effectively communicate, the speaking and the listening. So the speaking tool we talk about as self-advocacy, or sometimes the assertive voice. And this is helping our kids and helping ourselves find the language and the way of speaking that can help us get our needs met. Going back to our needs check-in. How can we help our kids get their needs met in a particular situation? So in your school, kids are learning the iMessage. The iMessage as a structure is used in many, many, many schools around the world. And it's as simple as this, helping our younger students articulate how they feel when something happens, but also really importantly, this piece at the bottom here, what they want to be different. Because it's one thing just to say, I feel frustrated when you take my homework or look at my homework. That's one part, but the really important part is them advocating and saying what they need to be different in that situation. That's where they're sort of claiming their power. As I said, the language we use, the tone we use, is really something we can help our kids with and coach them. Here are some things that often kids find us, they tell us that they like, that they find useful. We always like to start with thoughts, because often when we're thinking about conflict resolution, we start with action. What are the words? Who are you going to speak to? Where are you going to do it? We like to start with the thoughts first. Thoughts, feelings, and action. So what's the self-talk we can help our kids with? What's the narrative in their own mind we can support them to be able to tap into as they navigate a conflict, or as they go and assert or self-advocate? Things like, I have the power and courage to ask for this. I'm strong. This is fair. I'm just asking for what I need. Sometimes the body language we can really help our kids with. How do you present in terms of body language in order to really claim that power and feel confident saying what you're about to say? And then the tone of voice, to your lovely point earlier here at the front, the words we use and the tone we deliver them are so important. And maybe even role-playing with kids, how to navigate this situation. And you can exaggerate it a little bit with the tone and the words that you use, so they can really pick up on how important it is. Depending on the study you read, it's either like 75% or 80% of what we say is expressed through our body language, facial expression, and tone, and only 20-25% is actually the words. So it's really important to help kids tap into that.
So as Nick mentioned a moment ago, that is one half of the equation, though. So we have on the one side the speaking skills, the taking ownership, the naming your needs, the being assertive. So now we want to focus a little bit on those receptive skills of the listening skills. And so we call this one reflective listening. And we know there are so many different kinds of listening that we do within the day, and this is an opportunity to help our kids understand that as well. The sort of briefest way to think about this is a way to stay away from jumping to conclusions or offering solutions. I love this quote by Brené Brown because it reminds us in listening that we should be as passionate about listening as we are about being heard. And I'll self-confess that I could have used this information in my high school years. Because oftentimes I was that student that in class, when I heard anything, the way I listened was to immediately respond. I was always listening to debate or to correct or to answer. And if we think about a school, we know that our students are often in that setting, right? So we need to provide them tools and an opportunity to be in a space where they're listening to understand, they're listening to empathize, they're listening to connect. So I invite you all now for just a moment before we get any deeper into this tool to think back in your own life. Can you recognize for yourself as adults now the different times that you have been able to listen? Can you recognize times when you may have been listening to respond to that feeling you had inside? And can you contrast that now with the time that you really listened to understand? You listened to support someone, to encourage them, to really understand what they were saying and where they were coming from, and to help bring that into this next experience. And actually, that's a good transition into this concept of win-win, right? So as a concept in conflict, oftentimes we are put in a situation where it feels like an us or them situation. And with win-win, we want to remind folks that sometimes there are opportunities to meet both people's needs. Oh, there it is. Thanks, Nick. So in a win-win situation, pretty straightforward, it's finding that space between what I want and what the person with whom I'm in conflict wants as well. And disclaimer, we know that is not always the case, but we do a disservice if we don't explore this possibility in this creative space as frequently as we can and use this as an initial way into conflict versus it being the last thing that we check. It helps us with our problem solving, it moves us out of blaming into finding solutions, and it can be receptive. So you're listening to the other person again for what those things might look like. That could be a win-win situation. What we show to students is a little bit more simplified, but you can imagine in solutions there's kind of this quadrant setup where if there's two people in a conflict, both people could be in a lose situation. Their needs are not being met. There's a situation sometimes where first person gets their needs met, but the second doesn't, or conversely, the second person gets their needs met, but the first person doesn't. But we want to try to focus on this concept of win-win. So this example is one where students actually went through, and on each of these cards, there were a variety of different conflicts that were common among students. And then they were asked to come up with what would a lose-lose situation look like for both students in that case. What would a win-win solution look like? And what would a win-lose situation look like? And can you imagine where the most struggle, where the most effort was put in for students to imagine what the scenario looked like? For the win-win, right? Because that taps into their creativity. It isn't maybe something that's always modeled for them in media, in society around us, and so it took them a little bit more effort. But again, it's this opportunity to practice something that can become a lifelong skill.
So let's just imagine for a moment this sort of arc of a conflict. We've had that moment of grounding ourselves at the start. We've tapped into our inner voice, our assertive self-advocacy voice. We've been in that sort of space of listening. We've learned all these tools. We've touched on the win-win solutions. Sometimes at the end of a conflict, there is a sense that we can't really say we've moved on from it unless we've had some sort of apology or some sort of recognition of harm that was done. Now, how many times have you ever been on the receiving end of an apology? And as this other person's saying, you're like, you don't mean this. Like, you're just saying those words. Because I want to show you this little letter. It says, "Dear Brody, Miss P made me write to you this note. All I want to say is sorry for not being sorry. Because I tried to feel sorry, but I don't." Okay, I'm not saying any of your kids would ever say that. But often we say to our kids, like, I'm going to say this is like second grade, first or second grade. But how many times have we found ourselves saying to our kids, now you need to say sorry or you need to apologize, right? We all do it. It's normal, it's okay. One way that we can help our kids build an inner resilience and a resourcefulness around this area is by, instead of thinking of it as an apology, thinking of it as like a contribution. Because in a conflict, it is rarely just one person or the other person that holds sole responsibility. It's usually that there is a shared contribution for what happened, how this conflict arose. So we know forced apologies breed resentment, right? Because the kid who's forced to give that apology is now even more annoyed about the Legos than they were before. Instead, if we think of it as a contribution, we can say to both parties or multiple parties, what was your role in this? What was your one or two things that you did that you can acknowledge that was your contribution to how things got to where they got to? Also, an apology of action can be really helpful and empowering to kids once they've acknowledged their part in a conflict, to then be able to say, okay, well, next time, what might you do differently, or what might you think differently? And what could you do right now to build this sort of sense of repair with the other person? So those, friends, were our 5 tools. We do have a final aha to share with you, which I hope will be helpful. In your packet, from the QR code that we'll share again in a minute, there is a whole piece in there about something called emotion coaching. Emotion coaching is something that we've really been unpacking the session back in January and again today. And there are some steps in there about emotion coaching. Because one of the transitions that we know we need to make as parents as our kids grow through those elementary years into middle and into high school is to shift from that concept of parent as a manager to parent as like a consultant or as a coach. And as kids grow older, they need to be able to sort of think about things themselves, have more freedom, more autonomy, but they still need us. They still really need us in their lives to support and coach. So one of the ways in which you might be able to do that is through the tools we've shared today. But one other thing we wanted to make sure we said is, when kids come to you with something that's on their minds, a conflict they may have had with a sibling or with someone at school, how powerful it can be to say to them, hey, what do you want from me right now? Would you like me just to listen? Would you like advice? Or actually, do you just want a hug? Because by reframing it back on kids, for them to think about what they want out of the conversation with you, means that they can really actually say, look, Dad, I don't want you to give me advice. I just want you to listen. Okay, that building that resilience in them, that resourcefulness for them to articulate what they need in a conversation with us. and a really lovely sentence from a psychologist as well at the end of that kind of conversation, just to say, I know you got this. Like, you can do this, and I'm here to support you. Again, how empowering this is for our kids who are learning these tools at school, to know that, you know, we're right behind them, but we're not going to do it for them. We're going to let them sort of try and figure this out themselves. All right, folks, so we've been on our journey through those 5 tools. We want to pause before we finish off and offer a moment for appreciation and acknowledgement. One of the SEL tools that your kids are really learning and practicing as part of building a culture and a community is to acknowledge things that we are appreciative for, things that we've noticed, things that we're grateful for. So we would like to just offer a few minutes now at the end of our session for any of you just to share something in the world to do with this school or not that you feel a sense of gratitude or appreciation for. With kids, we really like to give them some sentence starters. So have a little think for a moment. Maybe I appreciate the way this school, or I appreciate the way my partner. I really liked it when. I'm grateful for. Any of those sort of prompts, or anything of your own language as well. Maybe I can start off by saying I want to really appreciate Trina and Azra for all their coordination in inviting us back here. Over to you all. Who would like to share something? You can just raise your hand and start speaking. Yeah, thank you.
I'm grateful that the school continuously provides parents these types of opportunities. It's not so abandoned. I found to happen in the U.S. schools, so I really do appreciate it. It's really a nice thing that they offer.
Thank you.
I appreciate the skills my kids are learning at school, and that they're even teaching me new things. Yeah, it's just fantastic.
Yeah.
I like to say that, you know, I thought I was a specialist in SEL, and then I had a kid, and now she teaches me everything, and I realize I knew nothing. Yeah. Thank you. All right, folks. Well, those were beautiful appreciations, and we can make sure that the folks who got a shout out then from the school make sure that they know as well. So our final message is to keep going. It's a hard time to be a parent, right, in this long tail of the pandemic and the challenges that keep sort of cropping up for us. Keep going. By the fact you are here today, we know you're doing a great job. And our email addresses are there if you want to stay in touch or have questions. And we'll hang around for another little bit of time. This presentation is available, the packet is available, and we would just love to hear from you if you have anything to ask or suggest. Yeah, Trina.
And I'd just like to say on behalf of ISKL, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Joe. We always appreciate your way of giving us space. Every engagement we've had with both of you over all these years, I'm going to get teary-eyed, I did not expect that, has been so fantastic in helping to support us with the tools to support students. When I hear your presentations, I take something new out of it every single time. The more we can learn to give them the skills and the opportunities to navigate that and to solve their own problems and to work with us through them and be open to it, really does help to empower them. So thank you once again. Please, parents, if you can, of course, stick around for your questions. And if you'd like to give us some feedback on any of these VOX presentations, there is a QR code on the way out. We'd love to hear what you've been enjoying about these presentations and what you'd like to see in presentations in the future.
Thanks, Trina. Thanks, everyone.